Question number 9.
Very good.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Does she agree with John Key that private schools have smaller class sizes and are better resourced than state schools? If so, will she commit to smaller class sizes and better resources for state schools as part of a future education funding system?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker.
Tēnā koe.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that Mr. Hipkins is referring to a 2005 article in which the Prime Minister talked about making a choice as a parent. I fully support the right of parents to choose what they think will be best for their children's education. What I commit to, Mr. Speaker, as Minister, is using educational resources in the most effective way possible to ensure choice for parents, flexibility for schools and results for kids. That's why the funding review is exploring how the education funding system could be improved so that the right resources get to the right child at the right time in the right amount. That's also why a number of proposed directions for change are currently being discussed with an advisory group that includes representatives from the sector, including the PPTA and the NZEI.
Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Why has she proposed removing the cap on private school funding and moving to a per-student funding model for private schooling, given state schools are struggling to make ends meet, resulting in demand for parental donations rising at 10 times the rate of inflation?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr. Speaker, helpfully, all of the background papers are publicly available on www.education.govt.nz, where the member will be able to ascertain that the proposal is for per-student funding for all students across the system, and what's proposed for those who are at independent schools is a predictable amount that it would be equivalent to how much the Crown would incur if those students were being fully funded in the state mainstream system.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, I did not ask the Minister to explain what the proposal was. I asked her why she was making the proposal.
No, and I felt on this occasion the Minister has addressed that question. She suggested there was a variety of reasons and available on the website. The member then did add some politics to the question with his last bit suggesting that state schools were struggling. So it's been addressed. No, it's been addressed.
All right. Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question. Chris Hipkins.
Why has she proposed removing the cap on private school funding and moving to a per-student funding model for private schooling?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr. Speaker, it's a matter of equity, and as I explained, at the end of my answer to the primary question, it is because I wanted to more clearly match the amount that would be incurred if those students were being educated in the fully funded mainstream system. It is because I want greater predictability and certainty across the education system, and it is because I want to support the diversity of choice that is available to all parents and which characterises New Zealand as a world-leading education system.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
If it's a matter of equity, as the Minister now claims, how is increasing funding for students who attend private schools, who by the Prime Minister's own admission already receive more resourcing than those in state schools and already have lower class sizes, how is that possibly going to help equity and help the achievement of students who aren't doing as well in the public school system?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr. Speaker, I am not proposing, and I want to confirm to the House that these are proposals and available for discussion. I am not proposing that the education system fund all of the costs. I am simply saying the equitable approach would be to fund more closely to what it would cost the system if those students were fully educated in the publicly funded system.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question. Chris Hipkins.
Will her proposal result in an increase in funding on a per-student basis for those students who are attending private schools?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr. Speaker, right now those children are New Zealanders who are attending a school by parental choice, and they are our cheapest students in terms of calls on the taxpayer purse. It is likely if that rude person would desist, it is likely that, having set a proportion, it would be greater, but I don't know by how much because we are consulting.
Getting back to its roots. Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order. Mr Anne Lees-Galloway, cease the interjecting, please. It's creating disorder. Order. I won't be asking you again. Chris Hipkins, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why is she considering increasing funding for private schools when 86% of secondary school principals are reporting they have insufficient government funding and are cutting field trips, available subjects and curriculum resources?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr Speaker, again, if I could point the member and his colleagues to the actual proposals, he would see that we are proposing a per-student amount for every New Zealand child going to school, and that we are proposing an additional amount for those most at risk of not succeeding, and we are proposing an additional amount for schools that are isolated in rural areas. The proposal as a whole is how do we give greater certainty and predictability to all school managers, how do we use data to ensure that we're getting impact for that investment, and how do we assure taxpayers that the over $11 billion we're putting into vote education is resulting in more kids being educationally successful.
Question number 2.